Kgotso, my name is Bexi Posbia and welcome to another episode of Zalingwe. If you are new here, please subscribe to my channel, like, and follow my page on Facebook so that you can get updates every time we post something. Today we're going to be talking about linguistics. So I thought it important that I first discuss what linguistics is and what we do, so that when we start looking at South African languages and South African linguistic issues, you understand the background of where I'm coming from, my perspective, and all of that. Linguistics. Linguistics, we call it the scientific study of language. So we scientifically study language. We observe how people speak. We observe how we interact with our languages, and then we make up hypotheses as to say this is what we think a language is, this is how we think language work, this is what we think language's role is, and all of that based on observation. So I think that's the important part. We scientifically study language based on observation. A lot of people ask this question when I say I'm a linguist, I did linguistics. How many languages can you speak? We don't necessarily study languages, like we don't necessarily learn to speak languages. We don't sit down. But learning to speak different languages comes as a result of doing linguistics, as a result of being interested in language and how language works, and studying different languages, how they are structured, and all of that. Then as a result, so if a linguist can speak different languages, it's a result, but not the primary purpose of linguistics. So there are two ways of looking at language. One way, it's prescriptive. So if you are looking at language in a prescriptive manner, you are looking at language in a judgmental way, in a way that says, this is not how you speak, this is how you speak, this is not how you say this is how you should say it, and all of that. So you look at language in a prescriptive manner. You are sort of prescribing, same as the doctor is prescribing medicine to their patients. So you are sort of like prescribing to speakers of a language to say this is how you should speak. So that way is being prescriptive. The second way is being descriptive. When you are being descriptive, you are observing, like we define linguistics, you are observing and drawing whatever conclusion that you draw based on what you hear the speakers of the language. So instead of being prescribing to say this is how you should speak, you are observing. You make notes of how speakers of a certain language speak, speakers of a certain dialect, or a group of people or a class of people, they speak. So you are merely an observer to say, I am observing, and whatever conclusion I draw is not based on my preconceived notion of what language should be like, but on what the speakers of the language are saying, of how they speak. So that's the view that we follow in linguistics. We are descriptive. We don't judge good or bad English. We don't judge good or bad Zulu to say no, Zulu and all of that. We don't say no, Sipitori, it's not Pedi, or it's not Tswana, or whatever. We don't say no, the Sotho spoken, for example, in the Free State as not proper Sotho and all of that. Instead, we observe and we become interested. We are curious as to, if we find the people who speak differently, then why do they speak differently? There must be a reason. Then it makes us curious to find out. Then we observe so that we learn about those people. So linguistics has a number of subfields. Language is a very, very complex thing, very complex. So we have a number of subfields so that we can cover all, not all, but most of the areas of language. First, we have theoretical linguistics that looks at the structure of language. How is language structured? We have phonetics and phonology that looks at the sounds of a language. As I'm speaking right now, I'm producing sounds. How am I producing these sounds? Which parts of my mouth or throat are involved in producing these sounds? That's phonetics and phonology. We also have, each and every language has its own sound system. So you find sounds in one language that you don't find in other languages. You find these sounds in this language you don't find in that language. So we study Siswati and Zulu, Pedi, and all of those languages. What sound is this language composed of? The number of sounds, and all of that. So that's what we look in phonetics and phonology. And then we have morphology. In morphology, we look at how sounds come together to form words. They don't just come together randomly. Each and every language has its own rules of how sounds should come together to form words. There are sounds that are not allowed to follow each other in other languages. There are sounds that when they follow each other in languages, then sort of changes the sound and all of that. They come together or whatever. For example, in most Ngoni languages, sounds do not begin with words do not begin with vowels. So any word that begins with a vowel, then you would find that there is a sound that is put in. For example, if I say E office, it's E, or these sounds are not supposed to come together. Then you get E hovis. That ho has sort of been put. E olinchi. They don't come together. Then you find sounds like E wolinchi to sort of accommodate that rule that says these vowels must not come together because of the rules of that language. So that's what we look at, the rules of languages pertaining to how sounds come together to form words. Then we have syntax. Syntax, we look at how these words come together to form sentences. So each and every language again has its own rules, how words come together to form sentences. Do verbs follow each other? Verbs and noun, can they come together? All of that, we look at it under syntax to say, how do words come together to form sentences? Then we have another field called semantics. In semantics, we look at meaning, basically meaning. What makes meaning? What makes a word meaningful? So we attach the sound to the meaning. Words, phrases, and sentences. We look also at things like idioms and proverbs, because they're also having to do with meaning a lot. So we look at it under semantics. Then we have pragmatics. Pragmatics, we look at context. What you say depends a lot on the context for people to understand what you are saying. Some things mean different things depending on the context where you say it. For example, in linguistics, when we say morphology, we know what we mean. But in biology, morphology means a different thing altogether. In linguistics, when we say syntax, we know what we mean. In coding and software development, they also have their own syntax. It means a different thing altogether. So that's pragmatics, where we look at context, how context play a role. As when I'm saying a word with my friends, when I'm saying a word with my parents, when I'm saying a word at a function, in a formal event, at work, and all of that. So context play a huge role. Then we have a field that we call socio-linguistics. I think that's one major field of linguistics. So it looks at language and society, the social aspect of language. It looks at things like, how do our beliefs shape the way we speak. For example, in African cultures, we are not allowed to call our parents by names. Therefore, we have to come up with ways of addressing them. We have to come up with ways of responding when my father calls me, because I'm not allowed to call their name. When I'm speaking about my father, I have to find ways. Even when I'm speaking in other languages, for example, you are not allowed to say you. to an elder. So you'd rather address them as the third person. Say, Ndate unabatla ing. When you are speaking to Ndate kienwa, but you are saying, Ndate unabatla ing, what would my father want? Me unabatla kietseng. So that's how our beliefs shape how we speak. We will also look at language contact. When two groups of people speaking different languages come together to trade or through wars and all of that, what happens to language? We'll look at language change. How does language change through generations and through the years? For example, we don't speak like our grandparents. Sometimes we don't speak like our parents. Our children don't speak like us. Why is that? We look at issues like that. How does language change over time? Then you get the field of historical linguistics that looks at language change over long periods of time, over a millennium or something like that, even a millennia, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. You can trace how language has changed and looking at how one language spread and became dialects that eventually became languages on their own. We look at dialects. What is a dialect? What is a language? How do we differentiate between a dialect and a language? The different kinds of dialects. You get regional dialects, you get social dialects, depending on class, and all of that. So we look at that under sociolinguistics. There are many other issues that are looked at. And then we have psycholinguistics. In psycholinguistics, you look at the language and the mind. As I'm speaking to you, I'm merely producing sounds. How do you understand me? How does your mind help me to perceive what I'm saying to you? That as I'm speaking, because it's a series of sounds that I'm making, how does your mind break it into words that make meaning to you? We look at how we acquire language, how children acquire language. I mean, they're born without the ability to speak, but soon enough, they learn to speak. How do they acquire language? We look at how do we learn languages, new words. How is the language organized in our mind? How does the mind store language? Does it store words together? Does it store certain parts like verbs, nouns together and all of that? How does it store things like tense? For us who speak South African languages, how are they organized in the mind? How does the mind know that when I say umuntu, I'm supposed to say uyahamba, not iyahamba, and all of that? How does it align everything so that you can produce coherent speech? And then when I produce that coherent speech, how does the next person understand me as I'm speaking? How does the mind move forward to try and predict what I'm saying or what I'm going to say? What's the next word that's going to come out of my mouth to help you as a listener to understand me? We look at all those things, the language and the mind. We look at also, is language an instinct? All of those questions, we ask them under psycholinguistics. Then we have neurolinguistics. In neurolinguistics, we look at the language and the brain. Where in the brain is the language faculty? We also look at disorders such as stroke. We call them aphasias that affect the brain and your ability to speak. So the mind, the brain, and language. Where in the brain is the language faculty? That's where we look at when we deal with neurolinguistics. And then we have applied linguistics. Applied linguistics is when we look at whatever we know about language. How do we then apply in the real world? How do we apply it in the real world to help ourselves, advance ourselves, understand language better, learn language better, make language work for us? So that's the practical use now of whatever we know about language. So you get things like language teaching. How do we teach language better? How do we teach language better, especially to adults, in a way that is consistent with the their minds, how they perceive language, so that they can learn language better? You also get fields like corpus linguistics, a major field where computers come into play now to help us understand language better, to help us develop apps that help us a lot, such as prediction, text to speech, and all of that. That's as a result of what we know about language being applied in real life. You also get one field that is gaining a lot of attention these days, slowly, forensic linguistics, where language is used in court to try and understand whatever case better is being dealt with in court. So linguists are called to court to analyze maybe speech, so that can give the court a better idea of whatever case they are dealing with. So that's basically what linguistics is, the fields of linguistics, and how we look at language. So in our next video, we are going to be looking at language. How do we define language in linguistics? And then we can start delving into South African languages. I hope you enjoyed our video. Till the next time. Khotso.